As far back as the founding of our country, women have been calling for equal rights. Abigail Adams, in her famous letter to her husband, founding father and our second president, wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have not voice or representation." Abigail's advice was not heeded. And so, 60 years later, in 1840, when Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met and became friends at the International Anti-Slavery Convention in London, the seeds for Abigail's promised rebellion began to grow in earnest. They were not allowed to participate and were forced to sit in a roped-off section of the hall, behind curtains, hidden from the men. Our suffrage story begins on July 13, 1848, when Stanton, Mott, and a few others met for tea at the Seneca Falls, New York home of Jane Hunt. During the tea, Stanton vented her litany of long-accumulated discontent about women's subservient place in society. Did you know that right then and there, the group decided to schedule a women's rights convention for the following week? At this first organizational meeting, they wrote 10 resolutions demanding that women should have equality in the family, education, jobs, religion, and morals, and a document based on the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Their document started with, "All men and women are created equal," instead of "all men are created equal." Later that night, Stanton added to the Declaration of Sentiments a statement on voting rights. It read, "He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation." When her husband Henry saw her addition, he told her it would turn the convention into a farce. Henry was very wrong. The convention was a smashing success. The resolutions and Declaration of Sentiments were passed and signed by 1/3 of the attendees, 68 women and 32 men, including Frederick Douglass, a leader in the movement to abolish slavery and racial inequality, as well as a fierce advocate for universal suffrage. In fact, Mr. Douglass seconded the motion to approve the Declaration of Sentiments, and his remarks convinced many in the room to support it. There was some positive press coverage of the convention. However, most of it was very negative, especially regarding female suffrage. One paper in Massachusetts, the Lowell Courier, actually said that with women's equality, the men will wash the dishes, scrub the clothes, handle the broom, and darn the stockings. In spite of the press, the women's movement was born. Did you know that the inspiration for this women's movement came from Native Americans, the Seneca Indian women from the nearby Iroquois Nation in upstate New York? These women already possessed rights beyond the wildest dreams of the suffragist. The Iroquois Society was organized to maintain equality between men and women. Some of the differences between the two nations were: Iroquois children were members of their mother's clan. American children were the sole property of their fathers. Violence against the Iroquois women was not tolerated. American men had the legal right and religious responsibility to physically discipline their wives. Iroquois women had control of their own personal property. An American woman had no right to her own property, her own body, or her own children. Iroquois women helped choose the chief, and American women had no right to vote. During the Reconstruction era of 1865 to 1877, after the Civil War, Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and others signed a petition for universal suffrage, calling for a national constitutional amendment to prohibit the several states from disenfranchising any of their citizens on the grounds of sex. The campaign was the first national petition drive to feature woman suffrage among its demands. There were some suffrage bills introduced in state legislatures during this time, but they were mostly ignored, and few came to a vote. Did you know that in 1869, the Wyoming Territory granted suffrage to women? In 1870, the Utah Territory granted suffrage to women. Also in 1870, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted, granting suffrage to former male slaves, but not to women. On November 4, 1872, Anthony cast a ballot in the presidential election in order to test the application of the 14th Amendment. 2 weeks later, she was arrested by a U.S. deputy marshal. 7 months later, she was tried and convicted. She had argued that the 14th Amendment guaranteed all persons born or naturalized in the United States privileges of citizenship. Since the amendment contained no gender qualification, she maintained that it gave women the constitutional right to vote in federal elections. She was not imprisoned, but she was fined $100, and she never paid the fine. During the 1878 U.S. Senate session, a federal amendment was introduced by Aaron A. Sargent, a senator from California and a dedicated woman suffrage advocate. Unfortunately, it languished in committee for 11 years before it was brought to a vote in the full Senate and lost by a total of 34 to 15. Did you know that an amendment posed in 1888 in the U.S. House of Representatives called for limited suffrage? It was for women who were spinsters and widows who owned property. It did not pass. It was becoming more and more evident by the 1890s that the suffrage leaders needed to broaden their base of support if they were going to get any legislation. Two suffrage groups, the American Woman Suffrage Association and the National Woman Suffrage Association, merged in 1890 to become the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. After the merger, NAWSA decided to direct their efforts to win state-level support for suffrage. Did you know that not only did the suffragists have to convince male voters, state legislators, and members of Congress that American women wanted to be enfranchised, they also had to convince American women, many of whom were indifferent to the issue? Apathy among women was, and still is, an ongoing obstacle. Despite the suffragists' hard work and efforts, not a single state granted woman suffrage between 1896 and 1910. It was time to try something else, and so they shifted their emphasis back toward passage of a constitutional amendment while continuing to press for the right to vote in the states and territories. Thousands of African American women were also active, although often overlooked, in the suffrage movement. In addition to suffrage, they addressed issues of race, gender, and class. They sought the vote as a means of promoting racial equality and effecting change in the post-Reconstruction era, advocating for suffrage in tandem with civil rights for all African Americans. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women met in Washington, D.C. to promote suffrage. Led by Tennessee's Mary Church Terrell, it was the largest federation of black women's clubs in the nation. Terrell was very involved in the feminist movement, not only for the rights of black women, but for voting rights for all women. Did you know that in 1900 she wrote in a February issue of the Washington Post that the elective franchise is withheld from one half of our citizens, many of whom are intelligent, cultured, and virtuous, while it is unstintingly bestowed upon the other half, some of whom are illiterate, debauched, and vicious, because the word people has been turned and twisted to mean all who are shrewd enough and wise enough to have themselves born boys instead of girls, or who took the trouble to be born white instead of black. In 1900, Carrie Chapman Catt followed Susan B. Anthony as president of NAWSA. Catt turned the focus of the organization to the passage of the federal amendment, while supporting women who wanted to put pressure on their states to pass suffrage legislation. She developed a strategy, later called the Winning Plan, that had several goals. Women in states that had already granted national suffrage would focus on passing a federal suffrage amendment. Women who believed they could influence their state legislators would focus on amending their state constitution. Southern states would focus on gaining the first step of the right to vote in primaries. And simultaneously, NASA worked to elect congressmen who supported suffrage for women. By 1915, NASA was a large, powerful organization with 44 state chapters and over 2 million members. In 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, freshly arrived from London, founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage to pressure the federal government to take legislative action. Did you know that one of the first things they did was organize a women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, March 3, 1913? There were 5,000 participants, a crowd of over 500,000 spectators, along with the national media. Wilson ignored them all. However, with World War I looming on the horizon, Catt announced NASA's support of President Wilson, even volunteering their services to the government if it should participate in the war. Although it was controversial, it was a politically astute move. NASA members served as nurses, relief workers, ambulance drivers, wherever they were needed in the war effort. By using NASA's over 2 million members and helping the president and government through the war, she knew she could call on him later for his personal attention to their cause. She argued that the sacrifices the women made for the war also made them deserving of the vote. She reasoned that if NASA had been openly and actively against the war, they would have lost the precious influence they had fought so hard to achieve up to that point. In 1914, the constitutional amendment, which had been nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was again considered by the Senate, where it was again rejected. In April 1917, the Anthony Amendment, as it was then known, was reintroduced in the House and Senate, again to no avail. While she was studying in England, Alice Paul met Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, leaders of a militant faction of the English suffragettes, whose motto was, "Deeds, not words," believing that prayer, petitions, and patience was not enough to successfully enfranchise women. The Pankhursts engaged in direct and visible measures, such as heckling, window smashing, and rock throwing, to raise public awareness about the suffrage issue. Their notoriety gained them front-page coverage. Alice joined their movement, personally breaking more than 48 windows, and was arrested and imprisoned on several occasions. Upon her return to America, Alice maintained that the militant policy is bringing success. The agitation has brought England out of her lethargy, and the women of England are now talking of the time when they will vote, instead of the time when their daughters would vote. In March of 1917, two women's groups joined to form the National Women's Party, or NWP. The NWP used aggressive tactics, including staging radical acts of civil disobedience and controversial demonstrations, to call attention to the suffrage issue. Did you know that the National Women's Party began picketing outside the White House in front of the gates? Known as the Silent Sentinels, they continued their pickets after the U.S. entered the war. They did not stop, even after the outcry that they should not protest a wartime president. In fact, 168 protesters were arrested on minor charges and sent to prison in Lorton, Virginia. Some of the women, including Alice Paul, went on hunger strikes. Some were force-fed. Others were beaten by prison guards. Eventually, following enough public outcry and pressure, they were released from prison. President Wilson's 1918 midterm election was facing great difficulties, and he knew he would have to deal with the woman suffrage issue. By this time, 15 states had extended voting rights to women, and by now the president had come to fully support the amendment. The proposed amendment passed in the House by one vote, then was taken to the Senate where President Wilson made a personal appeal, which was almost unheard of at that time. He tied women's rights directly to the war effort, asking, "Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering, sacrifice, and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and rights?" On September 30th, the proposal fell 2 votes short of passage, and the NWP started direct campaigning against the 2 senators who had voted no. Did you know that between January 1918 and June 1919, the House and Senate voted on the federal amendment 5 times? Each vote was very close, and it was the Southern Democrats who continued to oppose giving women the vote. Finally, the suffragists convinced the president to call a special session of Congress for May 19, 1919. On May 21st, the amendment passed the House of Representatives 304 to 89, and on June 4th, it passed the Senate 56 to 25 after the Southern Democrats abandoned the filibuster. Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul immediately mobilized the members of NASA and the NWP to pressure the states to ratify the amendment, sewing stars on the suffrage flag for each state as they ratified. By the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified, with only 14 to go. Did you know that by June of 1920, after much resistance from anti-suffragists and intense lobbying by members of NASA and the NWP, they had 35 of the needed 36 states? It was down to 1 state, Tennessee. With the vote scheduled for August 18th, opponents and supporters descended on Nashville to lobby the state legislators. But in the end, there was only one voice that mattered: Phoebe Ensminger Byrne, mother of State Representative Harry Byrne of Eastern Tennessee. In the final moments of the vote, he received a note from his mother, a great supporter of Carrie Catt. It read, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed Chandler's speech. It was very bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." Phoebe's good boy voted yes and ended 72 years of tireless campaigning by generations of suffragists. After signing the ratification certificate, the governor of Tennessee sent it by registered mail to the United States Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby. Colby's office received the certificate at 4 a.m. on August 26, 1920. And after determining that it was legitimate, Bainbridge, after 72 years, signed the proclamation of the Woman's Suffrage Amendment to the United States Constitution. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. About 6 months before the amendment was passed, the visionary Carrie Chapman Catt agreed to merge NASA and the National Council of Women Voters to become the League of Women Voters. Did you know that there is no other national volunteer organization in America that inspires such a great degree of commitment from its members? As a direct result of that commitment, the League of Women Voters has evolved from what it was in 1920, a mighty political experiment designed to help 20 million now enfranchised women carry out their new responsibilities, to what it is today, a unique, nonpartisan organization with over 800 chapters in all 50 states, and a recognized force in molding political leaders, shaping public policy, and promoting informed citizen participation at all levels of government. The 19th Amendment guaranteed us the right to vote, but it did not guarantee us equal rights. It took 72 years for women to win the right to vote in America, and as significant as it was not the end of the battle. During the 1960s and 70s, women were still marching, protesting, and fighting for equal rights. The right to open a bank account, the right to borrow money, the right to own a home or a business. And of course, the same battle women have fought for over 100 years, equal pay for equal work. Did you know that the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by Congress on March 22, 1972, and sent to the states for ratification? In order to be added to the Constitution, it needed approval by legislatures in 3/4, or 38 of 50 states. By 1977, the legislatures of 35 states had approved the amendment. In 1978, Congress voted to extend the original March 79 deadline to June 30, 1982. Did you know that the amendment fell 3 states short of ratification? However, 2 more states, Nevada and Illinois, did ratify the amendment, and as of January 15th this year, the Commonwealth of Virginia ratified and completed the needed 38. Unfortunately, there are still roadblocks to adding the amendment to the Constitution because of the 1982 deadline and 5 states that have rescinded their earlier approvals. Our own North Carolina state legislators consistently turned their backs year after year, refusing to ratify the ERA and assure women equal rights. Little by little, women have achieved their goals through the years of hard work and persistence, and now we tip our hats to the next generations of young women who are marching and protesting on behalf of the Me Too movement, asking only to be treated with respect and as equals by their male colleagues at work, at play, and at home. As Carrie Chapman Catt said so eloquently on the day we won the vote is power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, and prayerfully. The vote is won. 72 years the battle for this privilege has been waged. Voting is our only weapon to fight the portion of our society that would continue to treat women as second-class citizens. We won the first fight. We must win them all. We must speak out, we must march, we must vote, and we must never give up.